We live in an era where the self is the only thing left to worship. Every interaction becomes a competition. Men optimize their appearance with religious devotion, terrified of being outranked. The goal is to polish your image until you sit at the top of the hierarchy. This obsession is a symptom of a cultural sickness Friedrich Nietzsche warned about over a century ago. When a society loses its higher purpose, something has to take its place. For most of human history, living only for yourself was impossible. Drop a modern Looksmaxxer into a 13th century village and the premise of his life becomes incoherent. The private, isolated self did not exist yet. There was no privacy, no single bedrooms, no sanctuary where you could retreat to curate your image. You spent every waking hour inside other people's sightlines, which produced a shared identity. Survival was plural. Most of the population were peasants living on a lord's manor. You did not grind alone to outcompete your neighbor. A single person could not farm a field. You worked cooperatively or you starved. The cities did not release you into individualism either. Urban trade was governed by guilds. Your craft was owned by the brotherhood, not by you. The guild decided what you could make and who was allowed to train you. Morality was also not your own. Communities operated on collective responsibility. Under the tithing, a group of 10 people, your neighbor's actions were legally your problem. If someone committed a crime, the entire tithing was held responsible and often had to pay for it. You were, by law, your brother's keeper. This local web sat inside a cosmic hierarchy. Society was split into 3 divinely ordained roles: the bellatores who fought, the oratores who prayed, and the laboratores who worked. The scheme was rigid. It also meant you did not suffer the modern exhaustion of having to become someone. Your place was already set. At the center of the entire structure stood the parish church. It was the hub of social life. You did not worship alone. You worshipped as a collective. Monastic communities kept books of life, spiritual registers recording the living and the dead together. This world came with a bill. You could not leave it. The village that knew your name could break you for stepping out of place. What came next gave us the freedom to leave. It also handed us a problem we are still learning to solve. The self you were given was the self you died with. We now have to build our own. The old world did not end in a single day. It eroded. By the late 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was watching the erosion with alarm. He saw a Europe that still called itself Christian and had stopped actually believing. The churches were still full. The certainty underneath was gone. In 1882, he published a parable about it. A madman runs into a marketplace at midday carrying a lit lantern. He cries that he is looking for God. The crowd laughs at him. They consider themselves too modern for that kind of talk. The madman stares at them and says something the crowd is not ready to hear. God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Nietzsche wrote this line as a scream of grief. His point was that Christianity had done something for Europe beyond providing a religious framework. It had supplied the floor. The idea that every person carried infinite worth in the eyes of God sat underneath daily life, whether a person thought about it or not. Remove the floor and the house does not fall immediately. The people inside continue their routines, unaware that the structure has lost what was holding it up. Nietzsche called the eventual collapse nihilism. The word names the feeling of confronting a void where meaning used to live. The human mind cannot sit with a void for long. Something has to fill it. The hunger for meaning does not die when its object dies. It will find something else to eat. Nietzsche saw two possible futures for a post-religious Europe. The first was called the last man, a creature who had stopped reaching. He wanted comfort. He would congratulate himself on his happiness and blink when asked what he lived for. Nietzsche found him contemptible. The second was the Übermensch, a human being who had stared into the void and responded by creating his own values from the inside out. He built his meaning by hand. His life became a climb towards something he had decided mattered. The climb required a discipline a monk would recognize. Nietzsche knew almost no one was capable of it. Most people would fit in either category. They would still feel the hunger for greatness, but they would lack the capacity for the hard, lonely work of building meaning from nothing. In this state, the will to power still exists within the person. They don't collapse into the last man, but they have not actually achieved self-overcoming. They have outsourced their entire value system to others. They are not creating anything within themselves. Their striving is guided by herd morality. A man in this condition finds something to rank himself by. He trains against this metric with real discipline and real suffering, and he calls the process self-improvement. But whose self is he improving? In 1979, an American historian named Christopher Lasch published a book called The Culture of Narcissism. The condition he described has since metastasized into something he could not have predicted, though he saw the shape of it already. Lasch argued that the American self of the late 20th century was hollowing out. The institutions that once gave a person their identity from the outside, meaning the church, the extended family, the stable trade, the civic association, had weakened to the point where they could no longer do the work. A person raised inside those institutions arrived at adulthood already furnished. He knew who he was because other people had told him, consistently from birth. A person raised without them arrived at adulthood empty. He had to furnish the self himself. He had to manufacture an identity out of his own resources and then convince the world it was real. Lasch wrote in 1979, the numbers caught up with him. American church membership sat at 70% in 1999. It crossed below 50% in 2020, the first time in Gallup's records. The marriage rate has fallen by more than half since 1970. Robert Putnam wrote in his 1995 book Bowling Alone that Americans have experienced a significant decline in social capital, meaning the networks of relationships and trust that bind communities together. He showed that American League bowling had collapsed by 40% in a single decade, while the number of people bowling kept rising. People were bowling more, they were just doing it on their own, outside the leagues that brought people together. Lasch saw what this produced. He called it narcissism, and he meant something specific by the word. The clinical narcissist is not a person who loves himself. He is a person who cannot feel himself without a mirror. The self he presents to the world is a performance, and the performance requires an audience to continue existing. Take the audience away and the self flickers out. This is the condition Lasch saw spreading through American culture. Not pathological narcissism in the medical sense, a broader cultural version, an entire society of people who needed to be watched in order to feel real. Again, he wrote this in 1979. The mirror available to the average American in 1979 was limited. Television, a small social circle, maybe a workplace. The internet handed every person on Earth a mirror the size of the planet. 40 years later, a Korean-born German philosopher named Byung-Chul extended the argument. His book, The Burnout Society, came out in 2015, and it describes the world we actually live in. Han's contribution is one idea that changes how everything else looks. The old form of control was external. A king, a priest, a boss. Someone outside you imposed discipline on you, and you experienced it as oppression. You resented it, you sometimes resisted it. The new form of control is internal. The modern subject imposes everything on himself and calls it freedom. Han calls this auto-exploitation. The exploited subject and the exploiter are now the same person. The whip is in your own hand. A man in this condition cannot rebel because there is no one to rebel against. He cannot rest because resting feels like failing himself. He grinds himself down in pursuit of a self-imposed ideal and calls the grinding freedom. Lasch told us the modern self is fragile and requires mirrors. Han tells us what the fragile self does with the mirror once it has one. It uses the mirror to measure itself against an ideal it invented and punishes itself for falling short. The punishment looks like discipline. It feels like progress. The man administering the punishment believes he is becoming great, but he is only becoming a reflection. Looksmaxxing is a subculture that emerged online in the early 2020s around the project of making oneself as physically attractive as possible. It started in the corners of the internet where incels and bodybuilders overlap, and it has since moved into the mainstream among young men, particularly teenage boys. Its central framework is the PSL system, named after 3 forum websites where the taxonomy was developed. The system ranks men and women on an 8-point scale running from subhuman to perfection, with up to 2 points to be added for what they call sexual market value. You either mog or you get mogged. The practices escalate by tier. At the shallow end sit grooming routines and skincare and weightlifting. Then come the chemicals, testosterone, growth hormone, melanotan for tanning. Then come the devices and practices. Mewing, a tongue posture technique claimed to reshape the jaw. Bone smashing, to cause microfractures in the cheekbones to make them more prominent. Then come the surgeries, jaw implants, leg lengthening procedures that break the femurs and tibias and stretch the bones apart for months. The suffering is real, the discipline is real, but they are striving to increase their rank on a scale that measures how they are told others will perceive them. The most prominent public figure of this movement is a 20-year-old streamer named Braden Peters, who goes by Clavicular. His daily regimen, which he described in the New York Times in early 2026, includes testosterone, Accutane, retatrutide, and nebivolol. 4 prescription compounds taken in pursuit of a ranking invented on a forum, along with numerous other recreational drugs and supplements. He practices and preaches many of the Looksmaxxing methods mentioned earlier, plastic surgery, bone smashing, among others. Clavicular is Han's auto-exploitation 20-year-old poster child, disciplining his body harder than any medieval lord would have dared and calling it freedom. Bringing us back to Nietzsche, it may be tempting for some people to think of the Looksmaxxer as on the path towards what he described as the Übermensch, but this couldn't be further from the truth. The Übermensch is often misunderstood simply as a man of extraordinary willpower. Willpower is part of it, but it's not the center. The center is self-legislation. The Übermensch decides alone what is worth wanting. He confronts the void left by the death of God and creates his own table of values out of nothing. His greatness consists in the creation, not only in the pursuit. The Looksmaxxer does none of this. He accepts the scale wholesale. Someone else decided that the gonial angle matters. Someone else decided that clavicle width matters. Someone else built the ladder he is climbing and chose the summit he is climbing toward. He's not an incomplete Übermensch on the right path. There is another figure in Nietzsche's writing worth bringing in here that I didn't mention yet, but fits the Looksmaxxer a bit better. In the Genealogy of Morals, he spent an entire essay on the ascetic, the monk who fasts, the flagellant who whips himself, the hermit who deprives himself of every pleasure in pursuit of a spiritual ideal. Nietzsche's reading of the ascetic is that the suffering itself is the practice. The The will to power has nowhere external to go, so they turn it against the self, and the self finds a strange satisfaction in it. The discipline becomes its own reward, the grinding becomes the meaning. The Looksmaxxer obviously is not a monk, but the shape of what he's doing rhymes. The bone smasher inflicting microfractures on his face, the boy injecting compounds whose long-term effects are unknown, the willing submission to surgeries that break the femurs and stretch the bones for months. The discipline and the suffering is real. The medieval ascetic monk at least had a religious story that placed his suffering inside a cosmic order. The Looksmaxxer just has a forum and a set of standards established by someone else. A video surfaced in 2026 of Clavicular being outranked in a room by a larger and sharper-featured fraternity leader from Arizona State University. The clip went viral almost instantly. Clavicular had been mogged. On later streams, he was visibly upset. Viewers were commenting on how down he was acting after being mogged. Lasch's entire argument is contained in that reaction. A man whose worth is located inside himself does not feel bad when a stranger is taller than him. A man whose worth is located inside a comparative ranking system feels bad whenever the system produces an unfavorable comparison. He cannot leave the system. The system is where his self is stored. Every taller man in every room he enters for the rest of his life becomes a threat to his existence. Nietzsche had a line for this. He who fights with monsters shall look to it that he himself does not become a monster. When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. The man who built his identity on mogging other men lives in permanent terror of being mogged. The metric he used to claim superiority becomes the metric used against him. Every room he walks into is a test he might fail. The abyss is looking back. Clavicular is not the problem. He's a 20-year-old who found a market and served it. The market existed before him and will exist after him. If he disappeared from the internet tomorrow, someone else would take his slot by the end of the week. The streamers and the surgeries are what the phenomenon looks like on camera, but the phenomenon itself is much larger and quieter. A young man today evaluates potential partners and is evaluated by them through a grid of photographs on his phone. A boy raised under these conditions does not need to be persuaded that his face is his worth. The architecture of his daily life tells him so before anything else gets a chance. Looksmaxxing is the rational response. And of course, boys are not the only ones. The female version of this is older and further along. Facebook's internal research leaked in 2021 found that Instagram made body image worse in 1 in 3 teenage girls who already struggled with it. Cosmetic surgery rates among women under 30 have tripled since 2000. Eating disorders kill more young women than any other mental illness. The male version is catching up to the female version, not inventing it. The same mechanism, pointed at different features. Given a self that feels empty, mirrors that are always on, and an evaluative system that runs on images, of course young men and women optimize the image. The alternative would require them to believe in a source of worth that none of their inputs confirm, to invent alone, at 20, what a millennium of institutions once handed us for free. But none of this is an argument for going back to the old world. The medieval peasant did not solve the problem of meaning. He inherited a world in which the problem did not arise. The inheritance came with a price we have already refused to pay again. Most of us don't actually want to be born into a tithing, stay in the same place our entire lives, and have our career basically chosen for us. The freedom we traded that world for is a real freedom, and a freedom worth having. But a freedom to build your own self is also a requirement to build your own self. A right to choose your values is also an assignment to choose them. The institutions that used to do the work on our behalf are gone. We are left with the work. The mistake is believing the work can be done alone. Lasch tells us that the self capable of creating meaning does not form alone. The hard part of his prescription is the recognition that solitary self-construction is the disease he was diagnosing, not the cure. A man trying to invent himself in a room by himself is doing exactly what produced the narcissistic culture in the first place. Nietzsche tells you to create your own meaning. The hard part of his prescription is the create. You cannot adopt someone else's table of values and call it self-overcoming. The Looksmaxxer is the proof. These look like opposite instructions, but they're actually not. The community is where the self forms. The self is what creates the meaning. You need the first to do the second. The medieval world had the first and did not require the second because meaning was supplied. The modern world has stripped both. We have to rebuild them in order, and we have to rebuild them together. This is what distinguishes the community that feeds you from the community that hollows you out. The Looksmaxxing forum is a community, but it's organized around a metric handed down from outside it. No one inside that forum is becoming a person capable of choosing what is worth wanting. They are becoming better at climbing a ladder someone else built. A community that helps you become a self capable of self-legislation is rare and worth seeking. A marriage, though for many this is not quite enough. A trade, a faith if you have it. A craft with masters who will teach you. A circle of friends who know who you really are and will hold you accountable. The specific form matters less than the shape of the thing. A small group of people returning to each other to do something real in a way that helps each of them become more themselves rather than more alike. These groups still exist, they're just thinner than they were. They will not come to you, they have to be sought out, joined, and kept. The boy measuring his jaw is not the villain of the story. He is a natural outcome of the environment he has been born into. What he is hungry for is not a sharper face. He is hungry for a reason, and he is hungry for the people who will help him find one. If you enjoyed this video, you should watch my video on doomscrolling and the ancient sin of acedia. Also, consider liking the video, subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and leaving a comment about your thoughts. I love reading through what you all have to say. Thanks again, until next time.